On the morning of December 19th, 1944, inside a cold, damp French barracks in Verdun, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat across a table from his senior commanders. Outside, the Western Front was falling apart. 3 days earlier, 28 German divisions had slammed into the heavily forested Ardennes region, tearing a 50-mile gap straight through the Allied lines. German panzers were rolling westward, threatening to split the Allied armies in two and drive all the way to the Belgian port of Antwerp. Eisenhower looked around the room at men whose faces reflected deep exhaustion and mounting anxiety. Then he spoke. He told them that the situation was not a disaster, but an opportunity. He wanted an immediate counterattack against the south flank of the German penetration. He turned to General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was currently tied down in heavy fighting far to the south, engaged in the Saar Valley facing the German West Wall. Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take him to disengage his forces, turn his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and launch a major offensive to relieve the encircled junction town of Bastogne. Patton did not hesitate. He looked at the Supreme Commander and said he could attack with 3 divisions in 72 hours. On the morning of December 22nd, the room went quiet. Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, thought Patton was lying. Lieutenant General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, called it reckless grandstanding. Moving a single division off the front line in battle takes days. Patton was claiming he could disengage 250,000 men, thousands of tanks and trucks, reorient them along narrow, icy roads in pitch darkness, and strike a lethal blow over 100 miles away in less than 3 days. It sounded impossible. It sounded like suicide. I'm Arthur Finch. What Eisenhower and Bedell Smith did not know at that moment was that Patton was not making a wild boast. He had already set the entire machine in motion before he stepped into that conference room. Hours before Eisenhower even asked the question, Patton had left an explicit 3-word instruction with his staff that made the impossible operational shift achievable. I will tell you exactly what those 3 words were and what was written on a scribbled telephone notepad in Luxembourg at 11 o'clock that morning. But to understand why those 3 words mattered, you first have to understand the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the crisis facing the Allies in the 3rd week of December 1944. To most people today, the Battle of the Bulge is remembered as a heroic defensive stand by American paratroopers in the snow at Bastogne. That is part of the story, but it misses the operational disaster that threatened the entire Allied war effort. When Field Marshal Walter Model launched Operation Watch on the Rhine on December 16th, the Ardennes sector was held by just 4 American divisions stretched across an 80-mile front. The terrain was dense, hilly, and choked with snow and ice. The German assault, spearheaded by Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army and Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, completely surprised Allied intelligence. Within 48 hours, the American 106th Infantry Division was surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel, leading to the surrender of over 7,000 men, the largest single American surrender in the European theater. The 28th Infantry Division was broken into isolated pockets, fighting delaying actions along winding river valleys. The key to the entire sector was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. 7 major roads and 2 railways converged in Bastogne. If the Germans controlled Bastogne, their panzers could race west unobstructed toward the Meuse River. If the Americans held it, the German advance would bottleneck, choking their critical supply lines on narrow forest trails. By December 18th, Eisenhower realized that the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, had to be rushed into Bastogne to hold that hub at all costs. They made it into the town just before Manteuffel's panzers closed the ring around them. By December 21st, Bastogne was totally surrounded. 10,000 paratroopers and armored infantry were trapped inside a 4-mile perimeter, outnumbered 3-1, low on ammunition, short on medical supplies, and suffering in sub-zero temperatures without winter clothing. Now, look at the map from Patton's perspective. His Third Army was sitting down in the Saar Basin, over 100 miles south of Bastogne. For months, Patton had been preparing for an eastern drive into Germany. His units were deeply committed in combat against fortified German positions. His artillery was emplaced, his supply depots were set up to feed trucks heading east. His communications network, hundreds of miles of telephone wire laid by Signal Corps troops, was routed straight into Germany. Disengaging an army under fire is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in military history. If you pull troops out of frontline trenches incorrectly, the enemy following you will immediately notice, press forward, and smash into your retreating columns. You risk absolute catastrophe. Now add the geography and the weather. The roads between the Saar and southern Belgium were narrow, winding, two-lane rural roads covered in sheet ice and thick mud. It was the coldest European winter in 40 years. Heavy fog grounded all Allied aircraft, stripping away the air support that Patton relied upon. Think about what actually goes into moving an army corps. You are not just moving soldiers with rifles. You are moving heavy Sherman tanks that weigh 30 tons and slide on ice like steel sleds. You are moving 6-ton trucks, heavy artillery pieces, mobile field hospitals, radio vans, mobile repair workshops, and tens of thousands of support vehicles. Every single vehicle needs gasoline, every cannon needs shells, every soldier needs food. If two truck convoys meet at an unmarked intersection on a narrow, icy road in the dark, you get a traffic jam that can freeze an entire division for 12 hours. And 12 hours in December 1944 meant the difference between life and death for the men inside Bastogne. You'd assume Patton solved this by driving his men through sheer force of will, screaming at commanders and threatening court-martials. You'd be wrong. Patton was famous for his swagger, his ivory-handled revolvers, and his fiery speeches. But behind the theatrical persona was a master of logistics and staff organization. Patton knew that war is not won by rhetoric, it is won by tonnage, road grids, and precise staff work. On the night of December 17th, 2 days before the Verdun meeting, Patton began reading the intelligence reports coming out of the Ardennes. While Army Group staff in Paris was still trying to minimize the German breakthrough as a local counterattack, Patton saw the truth. He recognized that the German offensive was a major effort, and he realized where the threat was heading. On December 18th, Patton summoned his staff officers to his headquarters in Luxembourg City. He didn't ask them to debate whether a shift north was possible. He told them to prepare 3 distinct operational plans. He called his Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, and his supply officer, Colonel Edward Williams. He laid out 3 possible scenarios on the map. Option A was a minor shift to defend the flank. Option B was a medium-scale movement. Option C was the radical option, a complete disengagement of the Third Army, a 90-degree turn to the north, and a full-scale offensive with 3 Army Corps into the flank of the German Bulge. Patton told Maddox and Williams to calculate the precise road spaces, fuel requirements, and timetables for Option C. They worked through the night of December 18th in a cold room filled with maps, slide rules, and route tables. They mapped out every intersection from the Saar to Arlon. They designated specific northbound routes for tracked vehicles and separate routes for wheeled trucks to prevent congestion. They calculated how many supply trucks would need to be diverted from eastern depots to northern depots and how many field telephone wires would need to be spliced and rerouted. Wait. Think about what that means. When Patton drove to Verdun on the morning of December 19th for the conference with Eisenhower, he already had the detailed calculations sitting in his briefcase. So when Eisenhower asked him how soon he could attack, Patton wasn't guessing, he wasn't grandstanding. He was stating a fact, verified by 18 hours of grueling staff work. When Bedell Smith challenged him in the conference room, saying it was impossible to disengage and turn in 3 days, Patton looked him in the eye and explained the mechanics. He told Smith that he had already identified the divisions to lead the attack, the 4th Armored Division, the 80th Infantry Division, and the 26th Infantry Division. He said the 4th Armored was already preparing to pull back and that the order to execute could be issued within 5 minutes of leaving the room. Eisenhower was convinced. He gave Patton the green light. The Verdun conference ended at 11 a.m. on December 19th. Patton walked out of the barracks, walked over to a field telephone set up in a nearby office, and called his chief of staff, Hobart Gay, in Luxembourg. This was the moment. The operational shift began not with a trumpet sound or a dramatic speech, but with a coded phrase spoken over a crackling field phone. Patton gave Gay the code word to execute Option C. He ordered 3 full divisions, over 130,000 vehicles and men, to stop fighting, disengage from the enemy, turn 90 degrees north, and begin marching toward Bastogne immediately. What followed over the next 72 hours remains one of the greatest administrative and logistical achievements in military history. Imagine trying to direct traffic across half of France and Luxembourg without modern GPS, without digital communications, and in total blackout conditions. German aircraft were absent during the day due to cloud cover, but at night, German bombers dropped flares over key road junctions. To prevent detection, Allied truck drivers had to drive through snowstorms on black ice using only blackout cat-eye lights, tiny slits of low-intensity light on their front bumpers that illuminated barely 10 feet of road ahead. If a truck skidded into a ditch, there was no time to pull it out. Recovery teams pushed disabled vehicles off the roads into snowbanks to keep the column moving. Tank crews wrapped burlap sacks around their steel treads to gain traction on frozen slopes. Military policemen stood at freezing crossroad intersections for 24 hours straight, directing thousands of vehicles through the gloom with hooded red flashlights. In 3 days, 3rd Army supply officers relocated 62,000 tons of ammunition, gasoline, and rations. They laid over 20,000 miles of field telephone wire along new axes of advance. They set up new field hospitals, fuel depots, and repair depots along the road to Arlon. While 3rd Army was driving north, the situation inside Bastogne was reaching a desperate crisis. By December 21st, the German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and the 2nd Panzer Division had completely sealed off the town. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was holding a defensive ring spanning roughly 16 miles. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped well below zero. The troops were digging foxholes in ground frozen as hard as granite, using dynamite when entrenching tools broke. Medical supplies were almost gone. Field surgeons were performing amputations without anesthesia in damp basements. Ammunition was so scarce that artillery gunners were restricted to firing only 3 shells per gun per day and only at confirmed high-value targets. On December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag carrying a written demand from the German commander, General Heinrich von Mutwitz. The note gave McAuliffe 2 hours to surrender the town, warning that if he refused, an entire German artillery corps was prepared to annihilate Bastogne. McAuliffe looked at the paper, crumpled it up, and remarked to his staff, nuts." When he needed to send a formal written reply, he asked his officers what he should say. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard replied, "That first remark of yours would be hard to beat." McAuliffe wrote a single word on a piece of paper and had it delivered to the German envoys. Nuts. It was a brilliant display of defiance, but defiance alone does not stop 18mm artillery or armor. The men inside Bastogne were bleeding out. They were running out of small arms ammunition. They were eating cold rations out of cans. They knew that unless Patton's 3rd Army arrived soon, the perimeter would break. On the morning of December 22nd, exactly 72 hours after Patton had promised Eisenhower he would attack, the vanguard of 3rd Army struck the southern flank of the German Bulge. The assault was launched along a 20-mile front, led by Major General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division on the main highway from Arlon to Bastogne, with the 26th and 88th Infantry Divisions protecting its flanks. It was not an easy advance. The Germans had anticipated a relief attempt from the south, and it heavily mined the roads, blown key bridges across freezing streams, and positioned anti-tank gun screens in thick timber along every ridgeline. For 4 days, from December 22nd to December 25th, Patton's troops fought a brutal, grinding battle through deep snow. Every village along the Arlon-Bastogne road, Martelange, Chaumont, Warnock, had to be cleared house by house against determined German panzer grenadiers and paratroopers. Patton was relentless. He moved his forward command post right behind the front lines, traveling in his open jeep through snowstorms, wearing his heavy sheepskin coat. He pushed his division commanders mercilessly. When heavy resistance slowed the 4th Armored Division near Chaumont on December 23rd, Patton told Gaffey that speed was more important than caution. Bastogne was dying, and every hour counted. Listen to this. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, the weather finally cleared. For the first time in over a week, the dense fog and cloud cover lifted over the Ardennes. Within hours, hundreds of American C-47 transport planes filled the sky over Bastogne, dropping hundreds of red, yellow, and blue supply parachutes carrying medical kits, ammunition, and food directly into the drop zones inside the perimeter. At the same time, Allied fighter bombers slammed into German tank columns along the roads. The airdrops gave the 101st Airborne just enough strength to hold out one more night. But the ring was still closed. On Christmas night, German infantry, supported by Mark IV tanks, launched a desperate heavy thrust against the western sector of the Bastogne perimeter, penetrating as far as Hemrol before being wiped out by American bazooka teams and artillery firing at point-blank range. By the morning of December 26th, the relief column was less than 6 miles south of Bastogne. Standing in the freezing cold near the town of Clochimont, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, looked at the map with his infantry counterpart, Lieutenant Colonel George Jacques. Between them and Bastogne lay the heavily fortified village of Eisenhower, held by German troops backed by automatic weapons and anti-tank guns. Beyond Eisenhower lay the southern edge of the 101st Airborne's perimeter. Abrams didn't wait for formal orders from division headquarters. He turned to his tank commanders and said, "We're going through." At 3 p.m. on December 26th, a battle group led by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess in a Sherman tank named Cobra King charged down the road toward Eisenhower. American artillery poured a massive barrage directly onto the village ahead of the tanks. Boggess drove his tank straight through the shelling, fire spitting from its machine guns, smashing through German roadblocks. Behind Cobra King came half-tracks carrying American infantry from the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion. The fighting in Eisenhower was hand-to-hand, intense, and brief. Boggess did not stop to mop up the town. He kept his tank moving north at top speed, crashing through a line of pine trees. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26th, Boggess spotted engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion digging in beside the road ahead. Boggess popped his hatch, looked down at the dirty, exhausted paratrooper in a snow-covered foxhole, and called out, "How are you?" The paratrooper looked up, paused, and replied, "Glad to see you." The siege of Bastogne was broken. The narrow corridor opened by Boggess and Abrams was quickly widened, allowing supply trucks, ambulances, and heavy artillery to pour into the town. Hasso von Manteuffel's panzers had failed in their primary objective. The German offensive in the Ardennes had lost its critical momentum, and from that moment on, the Battle of the Bulge became a slow, bloody German retreat. Now, let's come back to the promise I made at the beginning of this video. What were those 3 words that Patton had scribbled down, and what was the detail that made this 90-degree wheel possible long before the Verdun Conference even began? History books often portray Patton's performance at Verdun as an act of pure military intuition, a commander acting on impulse and sheer bravado. But the archival records tell a different, far more compelling story. On the night of December 18th, 12 hours before he left for Verdun, Patton sat in his headquarters drafting the operational contingencies. He knew that if he moved his army north, his greatest enemy would not be German tanks, it would be phone lines and operational lag. In 1944, moving an Army Corps required issuing hundreds of pages of written field orders detailing march tables, unit boundaries, and supply routes. If a staff had to write those orders from scratch after a meeting, it would take 24 to 36 hours just to distribute the paperwork. So Patton did something unprecedented. He had his operations staff pre-write 3 complete, fully detailed operational directives for all 3 contingency plans before he left Luxembourg. Each written order was complete down to the artillery allocations, road use schedules, and radio frequencies. They were assigned simple code numbers: Plan 4A, Plan 4B, and Plan 4C. When Patton stepped out of the Verdun conference room at 11:05 a.m. on December 19th and picked up the field phone to call his Chief of Staff, Hobart Gay, he did not need to dictate a single paragraph of instructions. He did not need to explain road routes or division assignments. He simply spoke 3 words into the receiver: execute Plan 4C. That was the secret. Those 3 words set off a chain reaction that had been engineered to the minute while the rest of the Allied Supreme Command was still recovering from the shock of the Ardennes breakthrough. Hobart Gay opened a drawer, pulled out the pre-typed stack of orders labeled Plan 4C, and immediately dispatched couriers on motorcycles to every corps and division headquarters in the Third Army. Because Patton had anticipated the crisis, calculated the logistics, and pre-written the orders, Third Army gained a 24-hour head start on the problem. That single day of foresight was precisely the margin that saved Bastogne. If Patton had waited until after the Verdun meeting to start his staff work, his attack would not have launched until December 23rd or 24th, and the 101st Airborne Division would have been overrun or starved into surrender. Military history often focuses on personal courage, grand strategy, and dramatic frontline heroics. Those things matter. The men of the 101st Airborne who held the perimeter at Bastogne and the tank crews of the 4th Armored Division who bled along the road from Arlon showed unbelievable physical courage. But high command is about making that courage count. It is about logistics, foresight, and administrative discipline under extreme pressure. George Patton was often criticized for his big mouth, his vanity, and his aggressive temperament. Yet in the critical hour of the Western Front, his greatness lay not in his pistol belts or his bombastic speeches, but in his pencil, his slide rules, and his pre-typed field orders. He saw the operational truth before anyone else in the high command. He trusted his staff to do the math, and he executed a maneuver that no other army in the world at that time could have accomplished. It remains one of the most brilliant demonstrations of operational mobility and staff work in the history of warfare. If you find these deep dives into military mechanics and human history meaningful, you're welcome to join our community on Telegram. There's a link right in the description below where we share source material, documents, and further reading on these operations. I'm Arthur Finch. Thank you for listening. Until next time.